Everyone loves a good surprise, maybe a nice birthday party or a gift. But surprises are best left to our personal lives. In geopolitics, the premium is on stability and predictability. Boring, but necessary. But Saudi Arabia missed the memo. This weekend, the kingdom decided to slash oil output. They will produce 1 million fewer barrels in July. But that's not the full story. Saudi Arabia is going solo here. The oil cartel, OPEC Plus, has stuck to its previous cuts. They're not increasing cuts. Only Saudi Arabia has announced new cuts. Listen in to their energy minister.
As we have done in April, whereby the countries that had agreed to do the voluntary cuts have extended that voluntary cuts to end of 24. And I would have to call it the Saudi lollipop, which is 1 million barrel of reduction for the start that starts at the 1st of July. And that million is also extendable.
Interesting choice of words. Oil is arguably the most important commodity of our times. Dropping surprise bombs in that market is certainly not a Saudi lollipop, as he puts it. So why is Riyadh doing it? To prop up prices. In the months after Russia's invasion, oil was booming. Let's look at Brent crude. It's an oil index. In June 2022, Brent crude was $112. That's $112 per barrel. And now, $76 per barrel. It had fallen to nearly $70 by late May. Now that's bad news for the Saudi kingdom. Around 50% of their economy is built on oil. So what do? They reduce oil production to boost prices. It's economics 101. There are two ways to increase prices. You either boost the demand or you reduce the supply. Saudi Arabia went for the latter. They reduce the supply. They need higher prices to fund their grand diversification plans. But how high? The International Monetary Fund says $80 per barrel. That's what they need. At that price, Riyadh will be comfortable. But why isn't that happening? Why is that rise not happening organically? Because the global economy is not growing fast enough. Look at any industry. Travel has not reached pre-pandemic levels. Neither has factory output. So the demand for oil continues to be stagnant. Prices are not racing towards $100 a barrel. They're falling towards $70. Hence, the surprise announcement by Saudi Arabia. But there's a flip side to it. Higher oil prices can fuel inflation. That's what happened in 2022. Central banks have been raising interest rates to keep prices under control. They were just about to hit the pause button. But if oil rallies again, all bets are off. So what scenarios are we looking at? The most optimistic one is this. There is a grand economic recovery in the second half of this year. Factory production rises, people start flying again, so the demand for oil rises organically. That would bring stability to the market. If not, there could be trouble. Rising oil prices will worsen the cost of living crisis. How is India placed to tackle this problem? Well, there is some good news. We're not as dependent on Saudi Arabia. Around 40% of India's oil imports now come from Russia. That's more than Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Iraq combined. And since Russia has not announced any cuts yet, the impact on India will be limited. Having said that, it's not all rosy. 85% of India's oil is imported. New Delhi is ultimately at OPEC's mercy, like all non-oil producers. It's a major drawback of the global system. One so-called lollipop, and you pay extra at the pump. And here's what India should think about. The threat from China is real and it's not going away. The PLA may or may not have the appetite for war, but there's certainly no hurry to end the border standoff with India. So New Delhi must be prepared for all eventualities. The problem is the war in Ukraine. It is hurting India's preparedness. Supplies from Russia have not been steady, and now reports say Russia is buying back parts of weapons. It is repurchasing tanks and missiles that it exported earlier. A new report was published today. It talks about Russian buybacks. It says Russia is re-importing some military components, mostly parts for tanks and missiles. And what does Moscow plan to do with these? Install them in older weapons and deploy those weapons for the war in Ukraine. Next question. Where is Russia getting these parts from? India and Myanmar, according to reports. Both countries rely heavily on Russian military supplies, and now Russia is relying on them to upgrade its old weapons. There is customs data that refers to some shipments. 2 Russian manufacturers have been named: Ural Wagon Zavod and Russian NPK KBM. These are Russian companies. Apparently, they're buying back parts from India and Myanmar. Now, it is possible that these parts were defective and are being returned. It's possible that they will be replaced. But going by one claim, there were no records of these items being replaced, not until March 2023. So most likely, Russia is just keeping them for now, and it makes sense. Such parts are hard to come by for 2 reasons mainly. 1, the war is exhausting Russia's stocks. And 2, Western sanctions have hit Russia's manufacturing capabilities. Companies cannot find the components they need, so they're looking for alternatives, even breaking down civilian equipment like planes to cannibalize spare parts. So the plan to re-import parts makes sense. Russia's defense industry is under stress, and it has a bearing on countries that depend on Russia, which brings us to India. Defense deliveries to India have been running late. In March, the Indian Air Force made a statement. It said Russia is unable to deliver vital supplies. The Air Force said this to Indian lawmakers. There was a major delivery plan for this year, but the Air Force said it won't happen. It won't happen this year. Now, we don't have the specifics, but most experts agree that this is about the S-400 missile defense system. India has bought 5 of these from Russia. 3 of the systems have been delivered, 2 are awaited. And the IAF statement was telling. It was the first public admission of a shortfall from the Russian side. In the month of March, another report emerged. It said India would now get the pending deliveries by early 2024. Such delays tend to test the relationship. There are outstanding issues like payment for Russian supplies. Moscow recently complained about this. It said it has billions of rupees in Indian banks and nowhere to use them. Let me explain this. India and Russia have a trade mechanism in place, the rupee-ruble system. That is the mechanism. It is used to bypass the US dollar and Western sanctions. You see, Russia has been cut off from the global banking system, so India uses the rupee to buy Russian goods, goods like oil and weapons. This money goes into an Indian bank account in Russia. Similarly, when Russia buys something from India, it pays in the ruble. The problem is that Russia doesn't buy very much from India, so there's a gap. It gets close to 1 billion Indian rupees every month, according to one estimate, and every quarter this pile grows by 2 to 3 billion rupees. But since Moscow is not buying very much from India, it doesn't have a way to spend this cash. The same thing will happen when India gets Russian weapons. The same payment mechanism will be used. India will pay for those weapons in rupees, and Russia will not be able to use those rupees. As both sides try to resolve this, India is also reducing its dependence on Russia. Earlier, 62% of India's defense imports came from Russia. Now this number has dropped to just 45%. India has now shifted to other suppliers, countries like France, which now accounts for 29% of India's defense imports, and the US, which accounts for 11%. And this diversification is a good strategy because India cannot put all its eggs in the Russian basket. Moscow's war should not be allowed to compromise India's war preparedness. Speaking of hiked prices, let's turn our attention to the UK, the sick man of Europe. While inflation has been falling everywhere else, it remains stubbornly high in the UK. It is going down, but not fast enough. Of particular concern is food inflation. Food prices are about 20% higher than they were last year. This keeps aggravating their cost of living crisis, and their government still doesn't know how to address it. Last week, they were looking into putting price caps at supermarkets. Indians are familiar with the concept of a maximum retail price. But that isn't standard practice in the UK, and unsurprisingly, some companies are not willing to implement it. How will they price gouge if there's a cap? This is a standoff in the making between the government and supermarkets, and now a new idea has been floated, a universal basic income. Our next report has more.
What would you do if you were assured about $2,000 a month? Guaranteed that amount in your bank account. You may not have to worry about making ends meet. If that stress melted away, would you focus on your career more? Or would you stop working and take it easy? That's what the UK is trying to find out. A think tank called Autonomy is looking to conduct a pilot program, a pilot for universal basic income. It plans to test it out on 30 people in 2 areas in England. It wants to study how these people behave. The think tank hopes that the findings will pave the way to introduce universal basic income in the UK. Because, let's face it, the UK might need this. The country is suffering at the hands of inflation, more than almost anywhere else in Europe. Every country was hit by a cost of living crisis when the war in Ukraine erupted last year. But no one seems to be dealing with it worse than the UK. Inflation hit a 40-year high of 11.1% last October. It has climbed down now, but not enough. The latest figures show inflation at 8.7% in April. It was slightly more than expected, but that's not the biggest problem. It's what's driving inflation that's worrying policymakers in Rishi Sunak's government. Food inflation.
Whilst it is welcome that the headline rate of inflation has fallen, these numbers show there is absolutely no room for complacency in the battle against inflation. Food price inflation is still worryingly high. That's why we've had food producers farmers in supermarkets in to talk about what we can do to reduce the pressure there.
Food and non-alcoholic beverage prices rose by 19.1% year-on-year in April, almost 20%, for essentials like bread, milk and eggs. You can see why it has the British government worried. How long can people keep paying 20% extra for these basics? Or continue to deal with general inflation over 8%?
And it's currently running between 8.7 and 10%. What we've also had, because of the war in Ukraine, is vast increase in energy costs, and also food costs in the UK have bills have increased between 16 and 20% in the last 12 months. So everybody's feeling the strain, regardless of the level of income that they've got.
The Sunak administration is scrambling to bring food inflation in check. Their solution? Introduce price caps at supermarkets. The government floated this idea last week, and it immediately faced a backlash from major supermarket chains. Even though the price caps would be voluntary, the supermarket tycoons aren't having it. The British Retail Consortium put out a message. They said that the government should not focus on recreating 70s-style price controls. They should work on cutting red tape instead. Of course, the supermarkets would prefer the loosening of government regulations, but they're just the latest to rebel against the government. For months, the officials at 10 Downing Street have faced stiff resistance. Railway workers, nurses, paramedics, everyone has been taking to the streets. Everyone wants a pay rise to deal with the crippling cost of living. Sunak's government doesn't think this is feasible. They say it'll cost too much, empty the treasury. So it's been pushing back against striking workers. Downing Street even wants to enact a new law to undermine the right to strike. That's how much it's against increasing wages. In this scenario, it seems impossible that the government would agree to universal basic income, no matter what the findings are. But the think tank proposing the radical solution may not have to worry much. The study will be over around the next general election, and the way things stand at the moment, this government's inability to handle inflation may lead to their ouster.
The BBC chairman is rigorous, it's transparent, it's set out.
Have you heard of present bias? It's a term associated with human behavior. And what does it mean? It refers to difficulty in making lifestyle changes today to prevent a catastrophe in future. And we humans suffer from it. We are bad at addressing the risks of tomorrow because we often don't alter our behavior today. But why am I ambushing you with this reality check? Because I'm going to be talking about climate change, which is probably one of the biggest repercussions of our present bias. And why are we bringing this up tonight? Because today is World Environment Day. It is one of the biggest international days for the environment, and this tradition dates back to 1973. More than 150 countries are observing it. But what does it even mean? And can our actions, big or small, really make a difference? Our next report tells you. In New York, an art project made entirely of plastic waste. In India, a human chain along the banks of river Yamuna.
We are asking people to wake up and clean the Yamuna River.
In South Africa, food waste being recycled.
The world is in crisis. We all know about climate change, that our world is in trouble. We all have to do our bit.
3 different projects with different causes at heart, much like thousands of other campaigns in over 150 countries. But all of them talking about one thing, our environment. Because today is June 5th, World Environment Day. And this isn't just any other Monday. It is a global platform for environmental outreach. It calls for equal parts celebration and anger, all of it devoted towards the protection of this world. Each year, this day brings hope, collective action, and a much-awaited theme. And this year, the theme is Beat Plastic Pollution. It urges countries to look for solutions to plastic pollution, and that tracks. After all, the stakes couldn't be higher. We produce 430 million tons of plastic every year. Plastic waste pollution has doubled in the last decade. It is predicted to triple by 2060. Only 9% is recycled globally. Plastic pollution also has social and economic costs, which can go up to $600 billion every year. This is a crisis, and it's choking our world. Many of you may wonder, if this is such a big problem, why aren't our governments acting on it? Well, they're trying. The world could soon have a treaty to curb plastic pollution. It would be the first such legally binding global treaty. 170 countries have agreed to develop its first draft. While this sounds like too little too late, experts say it is a preliminary but crucial step. Because the world has deferred climate action for so long, and not just at the policy level, but also at a personal level. Our governments have certainly not done enough for climate change, but neither have we. Often what stops us is one common but vexing question. Can one person's actions really make a difference? If you have asked this before, you're not alone. The problem is so big, and our daily plastic use seems quite small. But personal action is inextricably linked to international cooperation. Without individual effort, there is no collective action either. If individuals hadn't come together, the Sunrise Movement wouldn't have camped out in the halls of US Congress, or India's iconic Chipko movement wouldn't have made waves. Climate action needs crusaders, a sea of them. So while we are scared for our future, our actions in the present must be loud. And no, that doesn't mean that you have to go on the streets holding banners demanding climate action. And if going cold turkey on plastic is too daunting, take the first step and minimize its use. Do other simple things, like stop wasting food and reduce your car use. Save fuel and save the planet as well. And it's not too late to make a difference. Of course, we also need ambitious government policies because we've already dangerously warmed the planet. Some parts of the world are burning, others are drowning. Some have off-season snowstorms and others are desertifying. The world is on fire, literally. So every day should be our own environment day. It may feel like a lost cause, But the future isn't set in stone. A different future remains possible, and it is up to us to decide which one plays out. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with India, an under-construction bridge collapsed in the state of Bihar. This particular bridge collapsed for the second time in 14 months. In Indonesia, worshippers climbed to the top of an active volcano to perform a religious ceremony. And June is the Pride Month. In Thailand, members of the LGBTQ community held a pride parade in Bangkok. And finally, what makes the 5th of June significant? We're taking you back in history. On this day in 1967, a 6-day war began in West Asia. This war was fought between Israel and Arab states, the states of Egypt, Jordan and Syria. The brief but bloody battle was a result of years of diplomatic friction. The war ended with a UN-brokered ceasefire, but it changed the map of West Asia. Leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.